Now for lesson 7.2, we're going to continue to solve quadratics, and we're still going to do it by factoring. We're going to look what happens when they're not equal to 0. Everything in our first two lessons have always equaled 0. So we're going to get straight into questions. So you can see clearly this doesn't equal 0, doesn't equal 0. So as we found, we can find the answer when it does equal 0. Therefore, we want to make them equal to 0. So I want to bring things all to one side. So this negative 21, if I want to move this to the other side, I got to add 21 to both sides. Negative 21 add 21 gives me 0. And then as I rewrite this, I can't combine terms here because these both have ends and this is just a number. So I just literally write it at the end. I just put the plus 21 there. Once we're at this stage, this is exactly like you were doing in the previous lesson. So we got to remember our methods for factoring now. So I'm looking for numbers that times to make 21 and add to make this middle number of 10. And with a little practice, hopefully we find that it's 3 and 7, because 3 add 7 gives you 10. So I'm going to fill in the two parts. I'm going to do add and n, 3 and 7. Also the plus, remember, tells you the signs are going to be the same. Because I'm trying to get negative 10, that's probably a clue they're both going to be negative. Negative 3 take away 7 is indeed negative 10. And then once we set this equal to 0, we can just pull out the opposites here. So instead of negative 3, positive 3. Instead of negative 7, positive 7, and you can check this answer to see if it works as well. 7 squared is 49, 10 times 7 is 70, and 49 take away 70 is indeed negative 21. You can do the same with the 3. 3 squared is 9, 10 times 3 is 30, and 9 take away 30 is also negative 21, so I can confirm I have the right answer. Question B, very similar. I got a number on the right hand side, so I'm going to bring it to the left hand side. So instead of doing positive 5, I'm going to do negative 5. On this side it cancels, leaving you with 0. And two numbers at times to make 5, I'm not going to have many choices for this. It's just going to be 5 and 1. This time with it being a negative number, I know the sign's going to be different. So 1 positive and 1 negative. 5 take away 1 gives me 4. Once I've got to this part and it's still equal to 0, I can just write down the answers. So negative 5 and positive 1, just by switching the sign on those questions. As we move a little further into the exercise, I have someone slightly more complicated. So my 9x, I know I want to move to the other side. So the opposite for that would be negative 9x. And as I write this down, I just want to keep this in that same order, as in I want my x squareds, then my x's, and then my numbers. And if that doesn't happen, then it can get a little confusing because you might be trying to work on a totally different number. So I want to move my 2 to the end here. This is my slide and glide method. 20 I know is 4 and 5. You really should do a table for this, but I'm going to skip through that part. As I times by 2, I'm going to divide by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 5 over 2 does not simplify, so the 2 moves back to the front. And I'm going to do a quick check just to make sure this is right. Negative 2 times negative 5 is indeed positive 10, so it looks like I'm good. And then now I can go ahead and write down the answer. Instead of negative 2, positive 2. Instead of negative 5, positive 5. Instead of timesing by 2, I can divide by 2. Now for part I, there's a couple of different ways that we can do this question. And students can sometimes get into a bit of a mix when they're doing this question. So I'm going to give myself a clean board. I'm going to slide this question across, and we'll move that one out of the way. So people want to move this 5t squared to the side, which is perfectly okay. You can definitely do that. And then I get negative 5t squared. This is positive 12t plus 9 equals 0. However, this is kind of difficult to factor because I have a negative at the start here. Normally I put things like t and t because that gives me positive t squared. With having a negative here, I know I've got to change. So this kind of gets a little confusing. Now you can either divide each term by negative 1, or you can just say I'm going to switch the sign of every term, and that also keeps the equation the same. So that would give me positive 5t squared, positive 12t becomes negative 12t, and positive 9 becomes negative 9. 0 we can't really change the sign of, negative 0 is still just 0. And then from here we're just into our standard question that we did last lesson. Move the 5 to the end and multiply. Try and find the numbers that multiply to make 45 and subtract to make 12. And with a little experimentation, you should find that that's 15 and 3. Signs are going to be different for this question, so I'm going to go with negative 15 add 3, because that gives me negative 12. Remember, I'm not finished at this point. I've still got to divide by the number I moved to the end. So I need to divide both sides by 5. 15 divided by 5 is 3. 3 divided by 5 does not simplify, so I move the number back in front. And if we can remember, we really want to check to make sure we did this right. Negative 3 times 3 is indeed negative 9, so I know I'm doing this question correctly. And then now I can go ahead and write down the answers. Remember, this is still equal to 0, that's why I'm doing this. So instead of negative 3, positive 3. Instead of positive 3, negative 3. And instead of times in by 5, divide by 5. Remembering, if you need to, you could also substitute back into the start of this question to check, do they actually give you a true statement? Now, there's one other way you could do this question as well, which tends to actually be a little bit easier in some ways. Rather than bring things to the left-hand side, if I have a positive t squared or an x squared, whatever it is, I tend to want to leave that and want to move other things to the other side. So 12t would become negative 12t, 9 would become negative 9, and then I do the same on both sides. So there's my negative 12t, there's my negative 9, and notice that this is exactly the same as this. So although I had to move 2 terms, it actually made the question possibly a little bit easier. But if you do get that negative term, just remember you can times through by negative 1, or you can just change the sign of each term to also get the correct answer. And that should enable you to do the next series of questions for lesson 7.2.